Hello, lovely people. We are back again, and we want to quickly go through the stages of shock. So, shock in itself undergoes three main stages, and these three main stages are interconnected. So, when you take the stages of shock, when an individual gets shock, just that specific individual might go through these three stages. Depending on when the casualty is being identified and the management being given, an individual might go through just the first stage. When the first stage is not well managed, then it will go through the second stage and then to the third stage. So shock can go through three main stages, and the three main stages are interconnected. So the three main stages, we can talk of the first stage as the compensatory or the non-progressive stage. So we have the compensatory stage or the non-progressive stage. And with the compensatory stage or the non-progressive stage, mostly I do say it is that stage that the body undergoes homeostasis. The body does something in attempt to resolve the shock. So let's consider what really happens under the compensatory stage. So under the compensatory stage, we've already established the fact that in shock, there is a reduction in the blood flow through the heart or in circulation. So you could see that the blood is supplying the heart itself, and then it is also supplying the lungs. When you take the circulatory system, we have the pulmonary, and then we have the heart itself, the systemic. So meaning that whenever there is any deprivation in oxygen, these two major organs are affected. So what really happens is that within the vessels that supplies the lungs and then the heart itself with oxygenated blood, there are some structures we call the baroreceptors. Baro means pressure. So these receptors are receptors that identifies what? The pressure with which blood is flowing through circulation. So naturally, in the anatomical nature of the organs, the baroreceptors are lining the vessels or the major sinuses, as in the aortic sinuses. So when there is a reduction in how the blood is being pumped or how the heart is being functioned, you'd realize that the blood is flowing steadily within the vessels. So the baroreceptors would pick up the sensation and communicate it to the brain that no, there is a problem with the heart, and the problem is that blood is not flowing as expected. So when the baroreceptors sends the signals to the heart or to the brain picks it up, and then the brain will stimulate the sympathetic nervous system to function. And then the sympathetic nervous system would cause the release of the catecholamines. So it is sequential. Baroreceptors would pick up the sense that blood is flowing steadily or blood isn't pumping well. And then these signals would be sent to the brain because the brain coordinates everybody's activity. And then the brain would stimulate a part we call the sympathetic nervous system. And then the sympathetic nervous system would release the catecholamines. And these catecholamines are the epinephrine and then the norepinephrine. And just as we said earlier on in our other presentation, the epinephrine and then the norepinephrine, their activity is to come and then assist in what? In vasodilation. So when they come, they contribute to vasodilation. Vasodilation in a sense that blood that was to be supplied to the peripheries would now be streamlined to the internal organs. So blood that was supposed to go to the extremities to help in movement, to help in the digestion, would be directed to the lungs, the heart, and the brain. That is one aspect of the compensatory phase. Another aspect would be that we know one other organ that helps in filtering the composition of the blood is the kidneys or the renal system. So the renal system has afferent and then efferent arterioles that assist in the filtration of blood through the renal tubules. What really happens is that within the glomerulus of the kidney nephron, as blood are being pumped into the kidneys for filtration, what really happens is that when blood isn't flowing well, blood pressure with which the blood gets to the kidneys is also impeded. So receptors within the glomerulus would also send a signal that no, there is a problem within the circulatory system. So this would initiate what we call the RAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway system. And these are a collection of hormones that would come to cause peripheral vasoconstriction. So peripheral vasoconstriction, in a sense that the blood vessels that were to supply the peripheries, the upper extremities, the lower extremities, the skin, and the muscles would now constrict. So the individual wouldn't be able to undertake vigorous activities, and the blood would be redirected back to the brain, the heart, and then the lungs, so that the tissues wouldn't die. And then again, within the renal tubule, we know that we have the part that helps in the absorption of or the formation of urine. So what would really happen is that instead of sodium and water to be filtered from the blood into the tubule for formation of urine, this time around the sodium and water which were to form urine would be reabsorbed back into circulation in order to increase the blood volume. So you would see that depending on the phase of shock, the individual would suffer from either moderate urine formation, or in severe cases there would be what we call anuria or absence formation of urine. This is because urine can be formed. It has been reabsorbed back into circulation in order to increase the cardiac output. So this is what really happens under the compensatory phase. And then when the compensatory mechanism fails, we move on to what we call the second stage. We move on to what we call the progressive. So the first one was compensatory or the non-progressive. Now the body couldn't increase the cardiac output as a result of the compensatory mechanism. Now the shock has progressed. So under the progressive phase, what really happens is that there is notable hypoxia. Now blood supply has been impeded, and then the amount of oxygen to the brain and then to the tissues are diminished. So there is what we call hypoxia. And this hypoxia, in the body's attempt to resolve the hypoxia, what really happens is that now, in order for the body to get energy from the nutrient and the blood, the body undergoes what we call anaerobic metabolism. So ideally, the body should undergo aerobic metabolism, where there is the breakdown and then the synthesis of body substances under the influence of oxygen. But we've already established the fact that in shock, oxygen is diminished. So the body would have to depend on other means to provide energy without the use of oxygen, and that is what we call the anaerobic metabolism. And this anaerobic metabolism would bring about the production of what we call lactic acid, So lactic acid would be accumulated within the blood, and the lactic acid would result in what we call metabolic acidosis, because the blood has its normal pH. It shouldn't be acidic, neither should it be alkaline. But now, the body's attempt to resolve the shock has resulted in the production of what we call the lactic acid, and it is acidic in nature. So the blood in turn becomes acidic, which we term as the metabolic acidosis. And in the body's attempt to dilute this acidic medium, then the vessels would have to dilate. That is vasodilation. And the vasodilation, we've already explained that whenever there is vasodilation, meaning that the BP would subsequently drop, because the vessels would have to rather constrict so that the blood flowing through it would increase its pressure. But when there is vasodilation, subsequently the pressure with which the blood is flowing will drop. So that is with the progressive phase. So you could see that under the progressive phase, now because there is notable hypoxia, the individual would become cyanosed, and then the amount of urine output would also become diminished. But unlike the compensatory phase, here you would see that there is a notable drop in the BP, the blood pressure. With the compensatory phase, sometimes because of the peripheral vasodilation, the blood pressure is somehow normal. But when it progresses, you realize that the blood pressure is now beginning to fall, and the body isn't having the energy for the individual to breathe. So respiration now becomes shallow, and there isn't tachycardia, but here you would see that the pulse also become lessened, because the pulse is how the blood is being felt within the arteries. Now blood flow is diminished, so the pulse also becomes weak and thready or slow. So the body also becomes cold and then clammy, because the body temperature is being influenced by the temperature of the vital organs and then the internal body tissues. That is the core temperature. So when blood flow is diminished, the skin becomes cold, clammy skin. So among these and others are some of the cardinal things you would see when the shock is progressing. Now, when at the progressive phase we are unable to manage, then it moves into the final deadly phase, that is the refractory or the irreversible. So it is really key for us to manage shock even when it is not noted, because we can prevent it from progressing, but we cannot reverse it when it gets into the irreversible stage. So the irreversible stage is the most detrimental aspect of the shock. At this phase, now the progression has become intense. So there is evident cyanosis or hypoxia, and then lactic acid production is also highly eminent. So if, let's say, at the progressive phase, lactic acid production was moderate, here it is in excess. And because it is in excess, it is the same lactic acid content that is being pumped to the heart. So the myocardium or the muscle layer of the heart finds it so difficult to function, and it is notable with intense hypotension. So the blood pressure would drop finally, and here, as part of the homeostatic mechanism of the kidneys would even not produce urine. So there is marked anuria, and then the respiration becomes weak and shallow, because where is the energy for the lungs itself to function and for the individual itself to even respire? So shock is a very deadly condition, and at the irreversible stage, the most dangerous part of it is that there is organ damage, that is permanent organ damage, and then Finally, when the brain tissues are dead, the individual automatically would die. So please, we studying the stages of shock is to help us so that at each point in time, looking at how the progression is going on, we wouldn't wait for the individual to get into the irreversible state, but rather, even when the individual is not suspected of having shock as first aided, we try that we manage the individual for shock, because it is best for us to manage when the individual is not in shock, but than for us not to be able to identify and manage when the individual is in shock and the individual gets into the irreversible stage. This video has quite been a longer one, but don't be bored. Stay tuned, enjoy it, and then have some lessons from it. Thank you very much.